Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us today from around the world. I hope you are all well. Welcome to this Reuters Events webinar on a supply chain network working together for enhanced demand planning and execution. I'm Hannah Van Nostrand, Project Director here at Reuters Events, and today I'm joined by Suresh from Edgeverb, Rogerio from Estee Lauder, Marcelo from Carry Out, and Antoinette from EY. Thank you very much to the four of you for sharing your time with us today. Could I ask that each of you panelists gives a quick introduction of yourself, where you work, and a bit about what you do? And I'll just start with Suresh.
Thanks, Anna. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Suresh Bharadwaj. I'm the product head for TradeEdge, a platform that we have built at Edgeverb. Edgeverb is a fully owned subsidiary of Infosys. I've been working on this platform for the last 12 years, bringing visibility to channel sales, inventory, and everything that is external to a CPG organizations. We work with large manufacturers, reducing demand latency for them.
Thank you so much, Suresh. Rogerio?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thanks for having me here, and thanks for the opportunity, Hannah, for joining you in this session, and thanks for the other participants for the opportunity as well. My name is Rogerio. I work for Estee Lauder for the last 6 years. I lead the global supply planning team. I'm changing roles, in fact. I'm moving from supply planning to IBP. So I'm going to help the North America team on building the IBP and improving the IBP. Estee Lauder, as most of you probably know, it's a consumer goods prestige company. We have more than 25 brands, prestige brands, including Clinique, MAC, Jo Malone London, a lot of very nice brands that we produce. I had a chance to work on supply planning for this company, this beautiful company, for the last 6 years. But before that, I had my experience built on Avon and Unilever, where I had a chance to work on several parts of the supply chain. So from manufacturing, procurement, customer service, so the whole range of almost 25 years in supply chain. I cannot believe I'm saying that. But again, thanks for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward for having a very nice and productive discussion.
Great, thank you, Rogerio. And to you, Antoinette.
Good afternoon, morning, or evening, everyone. My name is Antoinette Lagerwey. I am a managing director at EY in our supply chain consulting practice, and really exciting to be here with the team and looking forward to a great discussion today. My background for the last 20 years has been in end-to-end supply chain, from planning to execution, really focused on the IBP S&OP space at the moment, with a lot of the intersection between data, technologies, processes, and people. I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of different types of industries, a lot of process, fashion, retail, CPG type of companies, some life sciences and chemicals as well. So it's been really exciting, and there's so much going on in this space, especially right now. So exciting to share our ideas with you, and looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you, Antoinette. And finally, Marcelo.
Hello, everybody. Marcelo Crew here. So I'm working as the Associate Director of Demand Planning over at Carry Out. Company name you may not be quite so familiar with, but as extensively used across the United States in terms of with food products that are supplied through to restaurants, as well as packaging goods in plastics and recyclable units as well. My background has been working in the realm of launches, planning specifically, across various different companies. Some time with Procter & Gamble, with L'Oreal, which took me from the United Kingdom through to France and then to the United States, and having worked as well with Heineken Group as well, so an extensive experience in that.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you all so much for that. And to the audience, please make sure you are asking your questions to the speakers using the software here, and we'll try to answer as many of these as possible. In addition, you'll see we are running a poll throughout this webinar, so be sure to submit your answers here, and then we can share with the panelists to get their thoughts as well. So without further ado, let's get into the discussion. What does a supply chain network mean for demand planning? Marcelo, let's start with you.
Sure, thank you. I think I'm going to be a little biased in this in being a core demand planner and having such a passion for it. I think what's really interesting is everybody thinks about, classically a supply chain network, and you hear a supply chain, what's critical from the demand planning perspective is thinking of a demand chain and how do we have the real true signals, the best possible signals of what is needed out there in the markets, be it a consumer or be it at a retailer or be it at the distributor, all the way through the network, so that you can really provide the best possible signal and message through to your supply counterparts. What's really critical, I think, is we have the supply, of course, the physical goods going out through to market, but then that is all completely dependent upon a really strong, robust, and as accurate as possible information signal that goes up through to supply. So to me, in many ways, demand planning is where it really starts. It's where you have to try to be as strong as possible in what you're providing through to your supply partners, because there are just so many impacts that happen as a result in terms of production, importation, storage, logistics, all of those aspects.
Brilliant. And then I'll direct it to Rogerio as well. What does a supply chain network mean for demand planning?
I think more and more as the years go by, everything is integrated to everything, right? So we used to go from a linear supply chain with that supplier, factory, distribution, customer, right? And that evolved to the idea of supply network with several suppliers are connected to several. And now the evolution is we're saying supply chain ecosystems. And the idea of ecosystem is that everything is connected to everything. I think more and more for the demand planner professionals, understanding the supply chain upstream, it's a source of competitive advantage, because you're not only managing the volatility in the marketplace or what your consumer or your customers or your statistical models and everything, but how, as Marcelo was saying, how that signal is translated to supply and what is the ability of our supply to translate that signal into the physical move of finished goods. So understanding your supply chain upstream, I think it's a very important point for demand planners going forward. That's what I think it means for a demand planning community, understanding your supply network, right? So how imported goods can be impacted by transportation challenges, and what that means to your lead time, and when do you put your forecast in. So just examples of how things can be very integrated with the supply and demand balance.
Right. So you touched on there how supply chain linearity. So before the pandemic, supply chains were more linear than they were dynamic. And I think we're starting to see this change. But fundamentally, what does this mean? And Antoinette, I'd like to get your opinion on that.
Well, I think it's an interesting transition that we've been going through. And for some of us in supply chain, we'll tell you that transition's been happening for years, and that the pandemic has really accelerated that transition to building that ecosystem that Rogerio was just talking about, and really making sure that supply chain gets that type of focus, right? It's the elevating this really to the C-suite for a lot more insights to make sure that the right tools and effective processes are being put in place in order to manage to that ecosystem, which is something that hasn't really been the focus of a lot of organizations to date. So in that sense, I feel that the pandemic has really helped us bring attention to that need. It's one of the only ways I think the pandemic has helped any of us in any way. But from a supply chain perspective, I think it's a really exciting time to really build that ecosystem right now. And by looking at a lot of the different tools and technologies that are out there, the way that the businesses are operating, and really starting to question some of the fundamentals that we have held as truths within supply chain in the past, they're now being broken down to reestablish what this ecosystem is going to look like and what we want that future to look like. And since so many companies are going through this at this point in time, there's less of that fear that's associated with making some of these changes because it's recognized as truly needed.
Amazing. So Suresh, I'd like to get your thoughts on that, where supply chains, how maybe they were more linear, but now they're becoming more dynamic. What does that mean to you?
I think all of the things that Marcelo and Rogerio and Antoinette said, I couldn't agree more, with them. They were linear for a good reason, which is, when you talk about a company with the distributors and retailers and so on, it is linear, and it is also territorial in nature. A lot of that has to do with the physical nature of the supply chain. You've got to move goods, and so you need that, drawing the boundary, and then therefore, some of those aspects I don't think will go away. But what has changed is really the information flow. The information flow doesn't have to be, linear anymore, and that's where there's an opportunity for disintermediating, that aspect of information flow. I don't have to depend on my immediate channel partner, whether it's on the sell side or on the buy side. Especially if I know that in an indirect market, my distributor is not my end customer, and there is a retail outlet, who is my customer, and that's not even my consumer. The consumer is still one step further away. So when we talk, and I refer to the work that we are doing in terms of reducing demand latency. And what do I mean by that? I want to know what happens, what product is sold in what store, at a very granular level, as quickly as it is, is possible to transmit such information, right? So ideally, when a consumer checks out a product at a store, I would like to know that. That doesn't have to be, that has no physical dependency. With the kind of digital networks that we have today, you could actually get that. The same thing is true on the supply side as well. A lot of times the risks emanate maybe in a tier 2 supplier, and I'm not necessarily working with one tier suppliers. So, and I need to know that as soon as that risk is happening at a tier 2 or a tier 3, especially true for automotive parts manufacturing and discrete manufacturing industry. And therefore, how can I react to that? I shouldn't be the last one to know, that. So to me, the network is, actually about taking advantage of the digitization that is happening today.
Brilliant. Both really good points from Antoinette and you, Suresh. So Marcelo, I'd like to get your thoughts on that as well.
Certainly. Yeah, I think that when you're thinking about the sort of the inadequacies there, it really shows just the need, in a sense, it's kind of a breaking of the mold in a way. The way that things were planned out and scheduled. It really, kind of changes the approach to the challenge and how do you actually get to tackle this. And I think that, this is an area where you need to, essentially you cannot over communicate. You need to really ensure that you're having that discussion with as many parties as possible to really see how you can be as agile and flexible to the needs. One example that we've seen in our organization is really this balance between what we have as produced domestically, what we have imported, and how price has had a real impact on the import side as to sort of the balance of what we need to move towards. And for that, you need to really make sure you've got communication throughout the whole network and to be able to really pivot and move very fast as a result. That's something that's been a very recent challenge to us since COVID.
So as you've mentioned and others have mentioned as well, a more dynamic supply chain can be really beneficial. But in the past, what inadequacies have been exposed in supply chain planning processes, Marcelo?
I think the challenge was always, trying to be more and more efficient, try to see where you could trim the costs, and it was always with running to a leaner methodology without any kind of supply chain disruptions coming into play. And I think there's no bigger example of the disruptions that we're seeing as what really hit in terms of COVID, both on a supply side, but also on a demand side, and having to sort of tackle both ends of that at the same time, actually.
And Antoinette, what about you? What inadequacies have you seen exposed in supply chain planning processes in the past couple of years?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to the siloed nature of the processes. Everybody's focused in on their little bit and really not paying a lot of attention to the pieces that come before or after. And in some cases, even not thinking about how the information will be used going downstream. It's the number of times when you go in and you talk to an individual who redoes the work of the person prior to them in order because they don't trust it. So that lack of trust within the processes is really key. And what causes that lack of trust, I think, is fundamental to some of the challenges that we're seeing in supply chain. And the fear that really goes associated with that from an end-to-end perspective to keep the businesses running. So as we address some of those inadequacies, especially around the trust in the process and the data visibility and really bringing that forward, that's how we're going to be able to move that ecosystem forward.
And given the massive market disruptions we've seen, how have you seen supply chains change or evolve their operations to overcome these inadequacies? Antoinette, let's just go back to you.
Well, really addressing the points that I just brought up to make sure that they are really aligned to the strategic objectives of the organizations. It has been a kind of a beautiful example of what the human nature as we go through what we've been through the last 18 months and seeing the kind of heroics that people within supply chain have had to bring to the table in order to meet the demands that were out there, the ever-shifting demands from the ones that all the memes are about with the loss of or unavailability of toilet paper to some truly impactful business challenges, medical supplies and all those things associated with that. And those real changes have been completely wonderful to see those heroics come out, but it's not sustainable. It doesn't help us get to that ecosystem that we need, and we really need to bring that forward. So helping people do that, but in the meantime, we're still refueling in flight, as it were, to continue to run the business, because unfortunately the pandemic's not over yet and these disruptions are not over yet. We have to keep building on that. And so addressing everything from the logistics to container shortages and all of the different aspects of the manufacturing being slowed down in different countries for COVID or other reasons. It's, you know, we're not through this yet. And we need to make sure that as we're getting that ecosystem built, that we can bring those the right tools to bear and make it easier, both in the short term as well as that resilient supply chain that we want for the future term.
Great. And Rogerio, how have you seen supply chains change or evolve their operations, either within Estee Lauder or other companies outside of your organization?
Yeah, we tend to talk about the COVID and the pandemic thing, but I like to say, and I told that to my teams, that over the last 2 years we were living something close to the Apollo 13 of supply chain, because as Antoinette said, the heroic efforts. It was kind of heroic too, because we had the pandemic, which led to shutdown of factories, shutdowns of suppliers during I would say the worst moment of the lockdowns and everything. That had a ripple effect on your supply chain. But let's not forget that we had the Suez Canal blockage happening at the same time. We had the winter storms in Texas closing down oil and resin supply for plastic. And now we have container shortages in Asia impacting transportation. We're probably leading into one of the most deep crises in transportation that I remember in my career. With a lot of the prices and going up, and even the capacity available, right? So supply chain professionals had to be very creative. I think Marcelo said something that was extremely important, which is providing the visibility, right? So commercial partners and our commercial internal customers they were all making decisions at the marketplace based on information that we were providing them. You will have availability of this product or you won't, and then you have to shift your demand to something else, right? So that is a challenge, because not all the time you have the assurance that the future you're projecting is the right one, or you're making a lot of decisions in the uncertainty, right? And I'm going to bring an example for Estee Lauder, which is very close to us. Okay, so in the moments that we had the lockdown and people were working from home, or a big part of the population working from home and wearing masks, right? You can imagine what happened to the makeup industry, right? People were not using makeup. You can imagine what happened to the lipstick market when people were not showing their faces or their mouth, right? And you can also imagine what happened to the eyes part of the makeup, because that was the only part that people were showing up, right? On the other hand, the skincare, the fragrance were still booming, right? I'll give you another example. Once we came off the lockdown and the hair salons were opening, what happened to the market of the shampoos and professional products? So all that demand volatility that's happening in the market and is being communicated to supply in a already constrained supply, with suppliers in lockdown, with capacity. That's why I'm saying we are in the Apollo 13 of supply chain, because again, everything is connected to everything. Back to your question, Hannah, about how supply chain reacted. I think companies are, and talking to some colleagues, companies are revisiting their business contingency plans, right? Because when you have a Suez Canal block for 5 days, and it was 5 days only, and that had a huge ripple effect on port congestions and everything. Companies are now revisiting their business contingency plans to see, okay, what if something like this happen again? Are we prepared? Are we not prepared? So I think that's probably one of the areas that I see most of the companies reinforcing their investments and thinking on alternative supply, alternative ways to cope with the demand, right? In summary, and that's why we mentioned exchange information. We're going to talk more about that. A more volatile market in a already constrained supply chain only reinforces the need, as Antoinette mentioned, the supply chain professionals to find alternative and creative solutions.
Yeah, really great points, and so interesting to think about the effects of masks on various types of makeup. Marcelo, what are your thoughts on what Rogerio has mentioned?
Yeah, I wanted to absolutely build on that, and I think there's really a positive spin to this. You know, never had a time to take advantage of a crisis, really. You know, I'd say a couple of things. One, it's a real opportunity for us to be recognized in terms of all the work that we do. I think that you know, really being a supply chain professional is not just about being sort of the data scientist and the analytical side of things, but it's being the artist as well as the scientist. It's about sort of coming up with creative solutions as to how problems can get solved. And that's when it gets sort of very interesting and exciting. And I think that, you know, we've really had an opportunity to have a bigger seat at the table, in a sense, in the recognition. I think that chances are that the hottest MBA at the moment is in supply chain at this point. And it's, you know, it's good to see that really been at the forefront there. I think it's also an opportunity to really educate, you know, not just communicate, but also educate the other parts of the business of just how interconnected and how important it really is. You know, from my background working in the beer industry, there's what's called a 3-tier distribution model. So by law in the United States, you're not, as a supplier, able to go direct through to the retailer. You have to, by law, go through a network of distributors. So that encourages a real collaborative approach, working together with those customers and planning not what you're selling to them, but what they're selling through on their end and what they have in their inventories. And you really get close and work in partnerships when it comes to those sort of constrained supply pictures. There's actually an MIT beer game exercise, which is something I was leveraging and teaching to a significant portion of our staff. And it's really good as an opportunity to really educate and understand and have supply chain be more at the forefront of people's thinking, you know, when there are changes out there in the market.
Fantastic. And Suresh, I'd like to get your thoughts on this as well. How have you seen supply chains change or evolve their operations?
See, most of the planning systems have relied on historical data. So what happened, used to be that companies did their forecasting based on what they shipped to their customers or to their distributors. You could go back and look at, do I use 1 year's worth of data, past data, or do I do more recent history? But a lot of that is actually good for maybe midterm or long-term planning. What we saw happen in the last 18 months is really a shock both on the supply side and the demand side. You generally don't see that happen. Usually, like Rogerio was saying, the Texas freeze, is one thing. Similarly, there will be hurricanes every now and then, whatever. So there are certain shocks that happen on one side of the supply chain, but this is something that happened on both sides, and it was global. So there was no, you could go nowhere, right, with that. So the point is, how do I improve my short-term forecasting? So that means, your historical data is no longer any good. You really need to look at what's happening here and now. And it's not just your sales. There may be multiple events that are outside the sales. So weather is one of them. Competitive information is another. There could be a lot of things that are happening at the same time. How do I bring all of that together and react? So essentially, what has happened is people now want near real-time visibility. I would say real-time if possible, but at least near real-time. So what used to be acceptable, like it is good if I know what my partner sold last month. The time started getting crunched, saying, look, I really need to know what happened last week to what happened yesterday, right? So that's the level of visibility that our customers are looking for, so that rather than waiting for an order from the customer, I could take proactive steps to start replenishing those partners who are actually at risk of running out of stock, for example, right? So that is something that we are seeing as a change, getting to more real-time visibility to demand signals, and therefore being able to react to such situations.
Great. So we ran a poll at the beginning of our webinar today, and the question was, what is the biggest challenge you faced in your supply chain planning operations? And there were a few options that our audience members could choose from. It was data silos across the supply chain, interoperability, managing inventory levels in real time, or data rich but insight poor. So the results are in from our poll, and the overwhelming majority, 2/3 of our audience members, say that data silos across the supply chain are their biggest challenge. What are your thoughts on that? Is that a surprising result, or?
Not at all. And I think Antonio talked about silos as well. And so what happens with those silos is that there is the deviation in how a demand signal is perceived by the time it reaches the supply side. And everyone puts their factor of safety, and then there's the amplitude keeps going up in terms of variation from what's actually happening on the ground. And therefore, at one end of the spectrum, you could end up creating a lot of inventory that eventually has no place to go to. But at the same time, it's extremely important for the organizations to come together, not just place the entire onus on demand planners. So look, you're the guy who actually forecasted that. How much, this is how much we're going to sell. It's not that they're getting the forecast wrong. It's really are we having the right inventory in the right place? It's actually going to be very difficult for any one function within the organization to actually take the burden of that whole thing, right? So it's actually a collective responsibility of the organization. And for that to happen, everyone needs to be reading out of the same page. And what do I mean? So you need to have a single version of truth. Therefore, there has to be a single version of data that everyone is looking at. So this whole process of SNOP, is really bringing all of these different functions together. But if they have their own Excels, manufacturing has their own Excel, sales has their own Excel, marketing has their own Excel, and so on. So those are the silos we are trying to actually get rid of. And for that, you really need to have all of these signals coming to a single place, which everyone is looking at and interpreting the same way. Otherwise, the interpretations could go completely wrong.
Absolutely. Rogerio, I saw you nodding your head along to what Suresh was saying. What are your thoughts?
First of all, I don't think it was surprising, because if I was able to reply on the poll, I would go in the same place on the silence, right? So so it was not surprising, and it's a very interesting thing, and I think it was something that the pandemic, I would say the last 2 years, was actually something else that was surfaced as a big problem, right? The data silos. I think it was silos. I think it was a problem that we had before. The model that we have today, and I would say most of the consumer goods company, they have demand separated from supply, and regional, local, global models, and in different companies. But that model where you have the information, and then you take the information and you pass to the next area, and then the next area treat that information and pass to the next area, that creates, as Marcelo was saying, the bullwhip effect of the beer game, the traditional beer game, but reduces agility. And if you bring that to a global level, your demand plan could be in Asia, and your supply could be in North America, and your suppliers could be in Europe, right? So imagine the agility, is the information exchange is switching hands so much. So one of the things that I think we would all benefit is to move us, I would say we will have to find the balance, but where we create organizations that are horizontal, and you would see that information flow much more fluid. So that's one, because even the way we treat not only the information, but our own KPIs, the pandemic, I think, raised the thing that if you don't look at your KPIs in an integrated way, you start finger pointing. My WFA is low because of this, and my service is low because of that. And it's integrated, right? So WFA and fill rate are two KPIs that they go along together, right? So more and more, I think that we should be thinking about how one KPI can influence the other one. The other thing I want to add is this, right? So we're living in an area that we can't wait for 100% certainty, right? So you get to a point where you have to make a decision, and more you have to make a decision with less information. So as Suresh was saying, if we trust the stat models, and the stat model is based on the last 12 months, well, what happened in the last 12 months, right? You have to make some bets. I think more and more the supply chain professionals are being challenged to make bets and make decisions under uncertainty. So again, I'm going to bring another example, and that was a real example. We had a celebrity in Korea, social media singer, that she said, I'm using this MAC shade. That happened a couple of years ago. And that particular shade, and that celebrity in APAC, in Korea, is a very famous celebrity and a heavy influencer, right? That particular shade exploded more than 500% in our demand plan. No stat model, no demand plan, no IBP will get that, right? So when we think about breaking the silos, it's like getting an example like that, where we have a read on a social media, and we put that information in the hands of the planner who is planning lipsticks. And he has enough knowledge to translate that signal into how many units I'm going to put in, right? So we will be forced to make decisions and translate those signals to get agility, right? And by the way, that factory planner is sitting in Canada. So reacting to someone who is in Korea, right? And influencing Chinese consumers. So the world became a very small place in that sense. So I'm sorry if I'm talking too much. Again, what I think we have to think about is how can we make sure that that valuable information or that insight is not about the data, it's about the insight gets in the right hands of supply chain so we can make decisions earlier and make the appropriate bets. Absolutely.
I mean, great examples there. Antoinette, what are your thoughts on this this poll result?
Well, I actually want to build on what Rogerio was really saying there as well, because the data is really important in this and getting the signal through and all of the data. But especially in that example, what's also important is writing down the assumptions that you made associated with it, because so often a lot of stuff happens in our heads and it doesn't get documented, and then we lose the traceability for it. So in that kind of old adage of you need to slow down to speed up, because many people are saying, oh, I don't have time to document this. Don't have time to write it down. I don't have time to reconcile all my numbers from point A to point B. Whereas each assumption that you're putting into your plans has an impact. And being able to go back to some of those assumptions and say, was that an accurate assumption? Why did you do that? Should I take that lipstick example and should I replan it for next year? Or should I not? Should I make the assumption that it's going to be a different shade, but we don't know yet what shade, and therefore, what do I plan in my upstream? Those things I think are really important, and writing down that traceability is really key as we're going through these processes.
Absolutely. And Marcelo, I see you nodding your head along as well.
Full agreements. Yeah, I think it's really, really interesting to see this be a question. It is one of the main challenges. I think that, information really is power, and having that be spread out across the whole organization so anybody can actually get to see what the numbers look like at any time is becoming more and more important. Rogerio was talking about the model of a demand planner works away for a month, then cast it over through to the supply planner. We need to move faster than that, and have more of that sort of like real-time visibility. And I think Antoinette's point there, forecasting, you try to use as much as you can in terms of the science. You might have modeling that will be there. You might have the history, the seasonality, the trends, things like that. But then you have to also embed what are the sort of the list of assumptions. The one thing you always say about a forecast is it's always wrong. It's a question of how wrong, how quickly can you pick up on it, and how can you react to it. And I think what's really interesting is that, traditionally, when you have sort of a much higher degree of uncertainty, such as, say, a major promotion or a new launch, for example, that's where you might be looking at it much more closely in what I call hypercare. In the instance of what we're seeing today, with just so much more disruption, it's kind of the need for hypercare across the board in how we operate and react.
So we have a question from the audience that I think is quite relevant to all of this data talk, but quite important. It hasn't really been touched upon yet. What are some tangible ways I can influence upwards to stress the importance of trustworthy data in building resilient supply chains? So that's a question from Luke in the audience. Antoinette?
So I think there's a couple of different ways you can influence, and one of it is by continuing to escalate some of the challenges there, but in a very constructive way with solutions, right? Just going in and saying this is a problem, it's not bringing through to the importance of what the problem is. Really identifying what the result is and how it influences the business, exactly which one of the strategic metrics you're going to be impacting, and why you need to make sure that this is addressed at the highest levels really becomes important there. So communication, flow of information, and the direct impact on what the business results are going to be by giving some of those examples, right? We've tried, and Rogerio did really well in giving you guys some of those examples from his business, but by providing those examples, those tangible situations, people will really start to understand what the problem is and how to move that forward.
Absolutely. So agility and flexibility are words we are hearing quite a lot regarding supply chains. What does it mean for supply chains to be agile and flexible, and why is it so crucial for responding to unpredictable demand patterns? Antoinette, I'll bring it back to you if that's all right.
Sure. So for me, sometimes we come into those situations where there's buzzwords and we try to apply it to everything within the network. And for first, I think that making sure when we're talking about agile and flexibility, we understand that there's both an art and a science to it. And what does that really mean for the business? How do we address some of those shifting consumer and stakeholder and community demands? What is that going to mean? We cannot continue to rely on processes that don't leverage data and systems effectively. We have to address some of that to make sure that we're addressing the process at its core. We also can't rely on what I call muscle memory for decision making, where the decision that you might be making today, if you made that same decision 6 months from now, circumstances have changed. And while it might be the right decision today, it will possibly not be the right decision 6 months from now. And what are the triggers? And too often we go back to our muscle memory and sometimes in favor of speed to say this is the right decision. And it doesn't make the results what we needed to be. So that continuous focus, and that's where I think the IBP process really helps drive that agility and resiliency, is really important. And then segmenting your portfolio, whether by customer, by product, by business unit, and making sure that you're applying that agility in the right time and location. You don't want to bring in additional cost to a product that is ending its life cycle. You want to make really good decision makings on the things that are most important to the business. So be selective of where you use the agility, where you use the flexibility, so that you're not trying to apply it as kind of what they say here, the peanut butter spread across the bread, right? It doesn't need to be evenly spread across everything, and being really strategic about that will enable your business to really achieve those results.
Suresh, I would like to bring this to you as well. What does it mean for supply chains to be agile and flexible, and why is it so crucial?
So I'm going to talk about this from a supply chain execution perspective, shifting the focus a little bit from planning. So as much as we try to get our forecast accuracies up, if you're at the 60s and now you get real-time visibility with data, you go up to 80s. The challenge, the point is there is still that 20% gap, which is really a forecast error. And I don't think science will ever take us to 100% inaccurate forecasts anyway, right? And like Antoinette said, there's a little bit of art as well. How do we bridge that gap on the execution side is the question. And like I said earlier as well, it's not that the planners got the forecast wrong. It's also about, do I have the right inventory in the right place? And you could be concurrently experiencing out of stock situations in some locations while you have excessive inventories in other locations. And that's really what causes the forecast accuracies to go down, in some ways. But at the same time, if we have the ability to take demand from wherever it is coming from and be able to marry it to where the supplies exist and do so in real time, that calls for flexibility and agility. It's not like we were talking earlier, the linearity or the rigidity in the supply chain is has existed primarily because as a retail store, I have only one place that I'm going to order from, which could be my warehouse. If my warehouse is out of stock, they place an order on the distributor, and these distributors are pre-designated and say, this is who you place an order on. If the distributor is out of stock, he places an order on the company, and the company is out of stock, they all sit and wait until the company manufactures more product and then pushes down the chain. It is quite possible that another retail store is actually having the same product in sufficient stock, and they actually want to reduce it, get rid of it if possible. Do I have that visibility today? I don't. Both physically and even digitally. So that's important, and that's what the digitization of the network actually enables you. So what does that mean then? If your primary source of supply is unable to fulfill an order, can I in real time go look for alternate sources of supply? And this is what resilience is all about, right? And this has become the front page story the last 18 months? And how can I orchestrate such demand to go to where the supplies might exist? Of course, it has to be viable. I cannot just take it to some place where the cost of delivery is going to be, many times the cost of the product itself. So it has to be done in a viable manner, but that calls for flexibility and agility in execution. So that's my view.
Great. And Marcella, I'd like to get your take on this as well in regards to agility and flexibility and why it's so crucial.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting point that Rogerio touched on earlier, which was mentioning about sort of, how we're kind of moving away from the sort of linear supply chain concept to more of a sort of a network and in the opportunity there. And I think agility, going back to sort of the creativity and how you can really bring in some interesting ideas. We've seen examples where, we've had sort of very strict channels in the way that product gets to go to market. It's either something that's made or it's something that's imported. And it was kind of very well defined in that sense. Based upon the dynamics of changes of pricing, for example, it's made us actually think more in that sort of network methodology and to think, okay, how can we just sort of pivot the balance and actually have items that are at the same time both a make versus buy, and even then on the buy being something that can be sourced from multiple import partners. So I think that's where it really does involve more of that flexible, open thinking as to how to approach it.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I'd like to move on to the next question, and it's a bit more specific. So how can predictive analytics help break down silos across the supply chain? Rogerio, I'd like to get your opinion on or thoughts on this.
Yeah, that's what I touched on that lipstick example, right?
Yeah.
I think first of all, we talk a lot about let me just bring a couple of other insights, right? So that the pandemic brought, right? So once people started to go working from home, you can also imagine what happened to the traditional trade, like going to a mall and going to a department store, and to the online, right? Buying online. So just to give a reference, the online business for us double in the last 2 years, right? So this is just a sign of what happened, what happens in a case like this. So you put yourself in the shoes of a demand planner that does your demand plan by channel, right? You can imagine how it is, the drivers you're going to use when you're doing the forecast for a department store and when you're doing for your own online channel. It's a different monster, right? Different kind of so I think we're still finding out the solution. Back to your question, Hannah. How can we translate the sales drivers, so the number of doors, the market share, your organic growth, your acquisitions, your online footprint, how do you translate that, your social media responses and reads, right? We're still learning how all those sales drivers can be translated and funneled into a stat model forecast, right? So they need to land on something that we can deal with, and data that we can deal with. I think we're still learning on how to do that. But Antoinette mentioned something that was very important. I think the way you segment your business and the way you do proper inventory allocation it goes together with that, right? Because I saw one of the questions coming from the audience about what were the sacrifices that your company did in that environment, right? So one of the things, and I think the great majority of the companies did that, was to protect your hero products, right? So in a company, no matter how complex you are, you can have few SKUs, you can have a large number of SKUs, you need to do the protection of your hero products. How are you going to do your inventory bets? How are you going to do? And when you do your selection of your hero products, indirectly, what you're doing is that you're deprioritizing the codes that you're not doing. So this is a kind of a sacrifice you have to do, right? So how are you going to segment, and how are you going to do proper allocation of your inventory was critical, and I think it will continue to be critical to deal with those uncertainties of your, and that's again back to your question on the agility, right? We have to be, again, back to what Antoinette said, we have to be selective on where we want to be agile. In a portfolio with a third party or with your factory, you may have A codes that you want to be very agile and allow for flexibility, and some others you don't. You're going to put a bigger inventory and you're going to protect that with bigger inventory. So I think segmentation is the word that we have to use here, and find different solutions in different layers, different level, right?
Mm-hmm. So I ran a second poll during our conversation, and I asked the audience currently, how important is digitally transforming your operations to an interoperable supply chain network? And 57% of our audience members said it's their highest priority right now. So off the back of that poll, I'd like to ask Rogerio, in a data-driven market, how can adopting interoperability help reduce costs and ideally increase revenue?
So a couple of things on that answer. I think we are all in an environment where the digital project, the digital supply chain, you go and you read about what is the future of supply chain. Everybody's talking about digital, right? Everybody's talking about how you manipulate data and how you translate data into insights, right? I think 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, your answer to that was on the selection of your system, right? So are you using SAP? Are you using Oracle? Are you using JDA, right? So, and I think the world evolved, and the solutions are much more, I would say, simpler to use, simpler to test, simpler to pilot, right? I think companies are now doing much more pilots in terms of using data manipulation and how you transit information in your supply chain. So I think that's a good thing. The other side of the coin is 10 years ago, we used to say that every supply chain professional should also be an HR professional because of the amount of change management you handle. In today's world, you say every supply chain professional has to be an IT professional as well, right? So it's a broader scope. So I think more and more companies should make use of those pilots, of those attempts, and test a little bit more if the solution is applicable to their business or not, right? That there is we reach a point of no return in terms of investing in digital information and investing on systems that are going to translate that huge amount of data into very nice business insights. I'm still reflecting on the question about the tangible, how to translate all of that into tangible thing. I think supply chain analytics still, at least on the second level, third level analytics will help us answer that tangible thing, right? But we will never lose the art piece of the science, as art and science. We will never lose the art. And that's where investing in your business acumen, investing in your experience and your knowledge as a supply chain professional will help calibrate your bets and how artistic you are.
I love that. Yeah, Marcelo's, he's nodding his head and smiling. He's mentioned it really is an art, sometimes more than a science. Suresh, what are your thoughts off the back of that?
So, there are a couple of examples that I can take. One is the more real time you get to know what's happening in your channels, like I said, your ability to react to that becomes that much better. And digitization is absolutely important because your supply chain is only as strong as its weakest link. So you want to make sure that everyone in your network is as digitized as possible. So rather than waiting for, let's say, a weekly delivery schedule, that you would have normally, gone through, but there are certain stores, certain distributors who are going to run out of stock in the middle of the week or between deliveries or whatever. You could actually take proactive steps to initiate a replenishment without waiting for the distributor or your customer to place an order on you, right? So that is an opportunity that can be directly linked to either reducing lost sales, therefore increasing revenues. The second part is, as much as we get data, a lot of times, the question always remains, how do I trust this data, right? So there's always going to be I shouldn't say always, there are many instances where the data doesn't necessarily reflect the reality. We talk about phantom inventory all the time. What do we mean by that? The system is showing that you have certain product in stock, but in reality, that product is not in stock in the store. And therefore, the system is never reordered, right? Because it thinks it's still there. But you're seeing no sales for the product. And so when you go back and correlate, why there are no sales for a product that is supposed to be in stock, then you'll realize that there is a disconnect between the physical stock and the system information. So getting such information is possible only through digitization. And when you go and make an intervention at that point in time, you'll realize that, hey, this store is actually out of stock, and therefore I need to go back and rectify what the system is doing. So that's another example of where I have a revenue opportunity as well.
Brilliant. So we are almost out of time, but I'd like to finish with one last question. Looking to the future, what is in store for supply chain planning and execution, and how will we continue to see these operations evolve? Antoinette, I think we have a couple minutes.
Yeah, I think that's that one is it is going to continue to evolve. We don't know yet today what it's going to look like in the future, but it's all going to come about making sure that you have that resilient supply chain and that you're constantly looking at how to evolve the teams from there. So for us at EY, we look at it from three different angles. One, we've labeled that as humans at center, right? We need to make sure the humans are really at the center of the processes, and make sure that we have the people documenting all those things that we talked about earlier. Second, we look at what we call innovation at scale, which means looking at what innovations do you want to take are you scaling up? How are you moving that forward? And then finally, what we've called technology at speed, making sure that you're leveraging the latest technologies. And if you're building your transition from a supply chain and building that resilient supply chain perspective, since we don't know what it's going to look like, what's important is to define what some of the visions are. For some companies, they've started calling it their North Star, and understanding that your journey to get to that North Star is not predefined, and that you're going to need to question along the way, are we still on the right path? Do we need to make a different decision? Have we adopted kind of that fail fast mentality where we're willing to try things, and if it doesn't work, really to move it forward and to learn along the way, as opposed to punishing the process and giving up on the process as it moves forward. So for building that resilient supply chain, looking to see what that's going to be like, how do we leverage the people correctly? How do we do more with fewer people? And really take advantage of both that globalized world and that localized world, because it will be more of a combination aspect going forward to build that efficiencies going in.
Marcelo, final thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one interesting point to touch on is really in thinking about on the demand side of things, just what, AI, machine learning, what that's really going to be able to bring. And there's going to be tremendous strides that will be made in the future, not just looking at, a couple of factors, maybe case volume or looking at price points, but also, connecting into what might be posted on Twitter and all kinds of other factors that will be able to help. But I think what's really recognized from, the events of the last few months from COVID is that what you're going to get from the most sophisticated of the machine learning or AI outputs is still a starting point. It's not the end, it's the starting point. And that's where we don't build a forecast, we'll be more like mechanics, tweaking what is the output, but it gives us great, abilities to really jump in and to leverage what that is to make it final.
Absolutely. Great. Well, I think that is a great place for us to wrap up. We are at the end of our hour. Rogério, Antoinette, Suresh, Marcelo, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your thoughts with us today. All very insightful and thought-provoking for this discussion. And from myself and Reuters Events, thank you to the audience for tuning in, and we hope you will be able to join us for our next discussion. Until then, goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.